What happens when a single photograph changes everything you thought you knew about your family's history? For Rachel Thompson, a 28-year-old bartender working double shifts at a struggling tavern in Portland, Maine, that moment came when she served drinks to the most ruthless real estate magnate on the East Coast. For William Sterling, a man who owned half the waterfront properties from Boston to Bar Harbor, it was the beginning of questions he never thought he'd have to answer. She was just trying to make rent on her cramped studio apartment above the tavern. He was just another wealthy developer looking to buy out another piece of old Maine for his empire. But when Rachel noticed the antique silver compass watch chain, hanging from his vest pocket, identical to the one her dying father had clutched in his final moments, a buried truth began clawing its way to the surface. This isn't just another story about money and power. This is the story of how a casual glance at a family heirloom exposed 70 years of lies, murder, and the systematic destruction of a fishing family whose only crime was refusing to sell their land to the wrong people. The Anchor's Rest Tavern squatted on the weathered docks of Portland's Old Port like a barnacle on a ship's hull, stubborn and permanent despite decades of storms and economic hardship. The building had been constructed in 1847 from ship timber and local granite, and it wore its age in every creaking board and salt-stained window. Rachel Thompson had worked behind its scarred mahogany bar for 6 years, watching the neighborhood slowly transform around it as boutique hotels and upscale restaurants pushed out the fishermen and dock workers who had been the tavern's bread and butter for over a century. At 11:30 on a bitter February night, the tavern was nearly empty except for old Pete Morrison nursing his third whiskey and complaining about the weather, and 2 tourists from Boston who kept asking if the lobster rolls were authentic. Rachel wiped down glasses with mechanical precision, her mind elsewhere. Her father's medical bills had finally been paid off 3 months after his funeral, leaving her with exactly $47 in her checking account and a studio apartment she'd be lucky to afford for another month. The antique brass bell above the heavy oak door chimed with unusual authority, cutting through the low murmur of conversation and the distant sound of waves against the pilings. The man who entered didn't just walk into the Anchor's Rest, he took possession of it. His charcoal wool overcoat was perfectly tailored. His Italian leather shoes had never seen a day of honest work, and he moved with the predatory grace of someone accustomed to owning everything he saw. Rachel recognized him immediately from the newspapers and local television coverage. William Sterling, Sterling Development Corporation, the man who had turned half of Maine's coastline into luxury resorts and high-end condominiums, displacing entire communities in the process. He was the kind of developer who could buy the Anchor's Rest with petty cash and tear it down before morning to build another soulless hotel. Sterling chose the corner table near the windows, the one that offered the best view of the harbor and the most privacy from other patrons. He shed his overcoat with fluid movements, revealing an impeccably cut 3-piece suit that probably cost more than Rachel made in 6 months. Everything about him radiated wealth and power, from his perfectly styled silver hair to the gold signet ring that caught the tavern's dim lighting. Rachel grabbed a menu and approached his table, her professional smile feeling more strained than usual. The Anchor's Rest had been in the crosshairs of Sterling Development for 2 years, ever since old Frank Kowalski, the owner, had refused to sell despite increasingly generous offers. "Welcome to the Anchor's Rest," she said, setting the menu down. "What can I get started for you tonight?" Sterling's pale blue eyes met hers with the calculating assessment of a man who saw everything as either an asset or an obstacle. His gaze was cold, analytical, dismissive, the look of someone who had never questioned his right to take whatever he wanted. "Macallan 25, neat," he said without looking at the menu. His voice carried the crisp authority of old New England money, the kind of accent that opened doors and closed deals. "And I understand you serve food until midnight." "We do," Rachel confirmed, though she doubted their kitchen could produce anything that would meet Sterling's refined standards. "The lobster roll is popular, and we have fresh haddock that came in this afternoon." "The haddock will suffice," Sterling said, already turning his attention to his phone, dismissing her existence with the casual cruelty of the truly powerful. Rachel returned to the bar to pour his drink, her hands trembling slightly with a mixture of anger and anxiety. Sterling Development had been circling the Anchor's Rest like a shark scenting blood, making increasingly aggressive offers that Frank couldn't afford to refuse much longer. The tavern was failing, bleeding money every month, and everyone knew it was only a matter of time before Sterling got what he wanted. She carried the crystal tumbler back to his table, the amber liquid catching the light like liquid gold. As she set it down, Sterling reached into his vest pocket to check what appeared to be an antique pocket watch. The gesture was casual, automatic, but what Rachel saw made her blood freeze in her veins. Hanging from his vest pocket was a silver watch chain, but it wasn't the timepiece that caught her attention. Attached to the chain was a small silver compass, no larger than a silver dollar, its face engraved with intricate nautical designs. The compass itself was beautiful, a masterwork of 19th century craftsmanship, but what made Rachel's breath catch was the inscription she could just make out around its rim. True North always, in elegant script, with the initials JT etched beneath the motto. Rachel's mind reeled. She had seen that compass before. She had held it in her own hands just 6 months ago, when her father lay dying in his hospital bed, his weathered fingers clutching it like a lifeline to his past. "This was my grandfather's," Thomas Thompson had whispered, his voice barely audible over the hiss of the oxygen machine. Jeremiah Thompson. He was a sea captain, owned 3 fishing boats and half the waterfront before he had trailed off into a coughing fit that racked his emaciated frame. Before they took it all away, Rachel had tried to get him to explain, but her father had been delirious with fever and medication, speaking in fragments about stolen land, forged documents, and men in expensive suits who made problems disappear. She had assumed it was the morphine talking, the confused ramblings of a man whose fishing boat had been repossessed and whose modest house had been lost to medical bankruptcy. But Thomas had pressed the compass into her hands with surprising strength, his eyes suddenly clear and focused. "Keep this safe, Rachel. It's proof. Someday you'll understand." The compass had been sold 2 weeks after the funeral, along with everything else of value, to pay for the cremation and settle the remaining debts. Rachel had taken it to Murphy's Antiques on Exchange Street, where old Sean Murphy had examined it with a jeweler's loupe and pronounced it a fine piece. "Probably worth $800 to the right collector. 19th century maritime compass," Murphy had explained. "Beautiful craftsmanship. The engraving suggests it belonged to a ship's captain. These initials, JT, they might help establish provenance if you wanted to research the history." Rachel had needed the money more than the history. Murphy had written her a check on the spot, and the compass had disappeared into his shop's inventory. That had been 4 months ago. But there it was, hanging from William Sterling's watch chain like a trophy of conquest. The same compass her great-grandfather Jeremiah had carried, the same compass her father had died clutching, now displayed as a casual accessory by the man whose family had probably destroyed hers. "Excuse me," Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's a beautiful compass you're wearing." Sterling glanced down at the chain, his expression mildly annoyed at the interruption. "Family heirloom," he said curtly. "It belonged to my great-grandfather, Captain Josiah Sterling. He made his fortune in the merchant marine before establishing the family's real estate holdings." "Captain Josiah Sterling," Rachel repeated, her heart hammering against her ribs. "That's interesting." The initials on the compass say JT, not JS. For the first time since entering the tavern, Sterling looked directly at her, his pale eyes sharp and alert. The casual dismissal was gone, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. "I beg your pardon." Rachel felt the weight of his attention like a physical force, but she pressed on. "The compass. It's engraved with JT, not JS. I noticed, because my great-grandfather's name was Jeremiah Thompson, and he was a sea captain too. Owned fishing boats here in Portland before the war. Sterling's hand moved instinctively to the compass, his fingers closing over it protectively. When he spoke, his voice carried a subtle threat that made the temperature in the tavern seem to drop 10 degrees. "Young lady, I suggest you focus on serving drinks and leave the family histories to those who actually know them." The Sterling family has been prominent in Maine maritime circles for over a century. Whatever connection you think you've discovered is purely coincidental. But Rachel could see something flickering behind his eyes, uncertainty, maybe even fear. He knew she was right about the initials. He knew the compass didn't belong to any Captain Josiah Sterling. "My father died 6 months ago," Rachel continued, her voice gaining strength despite the danger she could feel radiating from Sterling. "Before he died, he told me stories about how our family lost everything. How men in expensive suits came with lawyers and forged documents and took away our boats, our land, everything my great-grandfather had built." Sterling stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the weathered floor with a harsh sound that cut through the tavern's quiet atmosphere. He pulled out his wallet and extracted several $100 bills, dropping them on the table with contemptuous precision. "I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing," he said, his voice low and menacing, "but I suggest you be very careful about making accusations you can't prove. The Sterling family doesn't tolerate slander, particularly from—" He paused, his gaze taking in her worn jeans, faded flannel shirt, and the general shabbiness of her surroundings. "Particularly from people who have nothing to lose." He retrieved his overcoat and walked toward the door, but Rachel's voice followed him across the tavern. "If that compass really belonged to your great-grandfather, then why does it still point to Thompson's Wharf? That's what the true north always means, isn't it? It doesn't point to magnetic north. It points to home, and its home isn't with you." Sterling froze at the door, his hand on the brass handle. For a long moment, the tavern was completely silent, except for the distant sound of waves and the soft tick of the old ship's chronometer behind the bar. When Sterling turned back to face her, his expression was no longer coldly dismissive. It was calculating, dangerous, and absolutely focused. "Prove it," he said quietly. The brass bell chimed again, and he was gone, leaving Rachel standing behind the bar with her heart pounding in the terrible certainty that she had just declared. War on one of the most powerful men in Maine. The $100 bills on the table felt like blood money. Payment for a meal he hadn't eaten, and a conversation that might have just sealed her fate. But as she looked around the Anchor's Rest, at the weathered ship timber, the old photographs of fishing boats and dock workers, the brass fittings that had been salvaged from actual sailing ships, Rachel realized she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every working family that had been displaced by Sterling's empire. Every fisherman who had lost his livelihood to luxury developments. Every piece of Maine's authentic character that had been sacrificed to out-of-state money and corporate greed. The compass had found its way back to her, even if she couldn't prove it yet. And if William Sterling thought he could intimidate her into silence, he was about to learn that Thompson blood ran deeper than Sterling money. She pulled out her phone and began typing a message to the only person who might be able to help her uncover the truth. Professor Elizabeth Hartwell at the Maine Maritime Museum, a maritime historian who had spent decades documenting the fishing families of Portland Harbor. If Jeremiah Thompson had really owned half the waterfront, there would be records. There would be evidence, and Rachel Thompson was going to find it, no matter what it cost her. The next morning dawned grey and bitter, with the kind of penetrating cold that cut through wool coats and settled into bones. Rachel had barely slept, her mind churning with questions and half-formed plans. She'd left 3 voicemails for Professor Hartwell and sent 2 emails, trying to strike the right balance between urgency and credibility. How did you explain to a respected academic that you just confronted a billionaire about a stolen compass without sounding like either a lunatic or a gold digger? The Anchor's Rest was closed on Tuesdays, which gave Rachel the entire day to investigate. She started where any good research began in the digital age, the Portland Public Library's local history section. The stone building on Congress Street had been a fixture of the city since 1888, and its archives contained everything from old newspaper clippings to maritime records dating back to the colonial period. Martha Russo, the head librarian, was a woman in her 60s who had worked in the local history department for over 30 years. She knew every family story, every piece of maritime lore, and every skeleton in Portland's historical closet. "Thompson," Martha mused, pulling up records on her computer terminal. "I remember that name from the old shipping manifests. What was your great-grandfather's full name?" "Jeremiah Thompson. My father said he was a sea captain who owned fishing boats before World War II. Martha's fingers flew across the keyboard, accessing databases that weren't available to the general public. After several minutes, she looked up with interest. "Oh my. Jeremiah Thompson wasn't just a sea captain, Rachel. He was one of the most successful fishermen in Portland Harbor. According to these records, he owned 4 boats, the Mary Catherine, the Portland Belle, the Seabird, and the Compass Rose, and he held fishing rights to some of the most productive waters off the Maine coast." Rachel leaned forward, her pulse quickening. "What happened to him?" "To the boats?" Martha continued scrolling through the records, her expression growing more puzzled. "That's odd. According to the Maritime Registry, all 4 boats were sold in 1943 to Sterling Maritime Holdings. But there's no record of the sale price, and the ownership transfer documents are unusual." "Unusual how?" "Well, typically these transfers would include detailed financial records, liens, that sort of thing. But these documents are very bare bones, almost like they were processed in a hurry." Martha paused, frowning at her screen. "And here's something even stranger. According to the Portland Harbor Master's records, Jeremiah Thompson died in a boating accident in August 1943, just 3 weeks after the boats were sold. A chill ran down Rachel's spine that had nothing to do with the February weather. "What kind of boating accident?" "The official report says his dinghy capsized in rough weather near Thompson's Wharf. But—" Martha hesitated, as if unsure whether to continue. "But what?" "Rachel, I've been studying maritime records for decades. Jeremiah Thompson was an experienced captain who had been working these waters for 20 years. The idea that he would take a small boat out in rough weather, especially near his own wharf, where he knew every current and tide pattern. It doesn't make sense." Martha pulled up another document. This one a newspaper clipping from the Portland Press-Herald, dated August 15th, 1943. The headline read, "Local Sea Captain Dies in Boating Mishap." The article was brief, just 3 paragraphs, but one detail jumped out at Rachel. Captain Thompson is survived by his son, Thomas Thompson, aged 12, who will be cared for by relatives in Massachusetts following the sale of the family's fishing business to Sterling Maritime Holdings. "My father," Rachel whispered. "He was 12 when his father died." Martha nodded sympathetically. "And according to this, he was sent away to live with relatives immediately after the funeral. That would explain why he might not have known all the details about what really happened to the family business." Rachel stared at the newspaper clipping, her mind racing. The timeline was suspicious. Jeremiah Thompson sells his entire fishing operation to Sterling Maritime Holdings, then dies in a convenient accident 3 weeks later, and his 12-year-old son is immediately shipped off to Massachusetts. It looked less like a tragic coincidence and more like a systematic elimination of inconvenient obstacles. "Martha, do you have records of what Sterling Maritime Holdings was before 1943? "Who owned it?" Martha pulled up another database, this one focusing on corporate registrations. Sterling Maritime Holdings was incorporated in 1941 by one Josiah Sterling, who claimed to be a former merchant marine captain. But here's what's interesting: there's no record of any Josiah Sterling in the merchant marine registers before 1941. It's like he appeared out of nowhere. The pieces were starting to come together, and the picture they formed was ugly. Josiah Sterling had arrived in Portland in 1941. established a maritime holding company with no apparent background in the industry, then systematically acquired Jeremiah Thompson's fishing empire through what appeared to be coercion and possibly murder. "Is there any way to find out more about this Josiah Sterling?" Rachel asked. Martha's eyes lit up with the gleam of a researcher who had caught the scent of a mystery. "Actually, yes. The Maine Historical Society has a collection of photographs from the waterfront during the 1940s. They might have images of both men. Would you like me to make some calls?" 2 hours later, Rachel found herself in the climate-controlled archives of the Maine Historical Society, wearing white cotton gloves and carefully examining black and white photographs that had been donated by various Portland families over the decades. The collection was extensive. Hundreds of images of fishing boats, dock workers, family gatherings, and business meetings that documented life on the waterfront during World War II. Dr. Samuel Greenfield, the Society's archivist, had been enthusiastic about helping once Martha Russo had explained what they were looking for. He had pulled boxes of photographs and maritime documents, spreading them across a long table in the research room. "These are from the Portland Harbor Collection," Dr. Greenfield explained, indicating one box, donated by the families of fishermen and dock workers. "And these," he gestured to another box, "are from the Sterling Family Collection, donated in 1987 by William Sterling's father, when he was trying to establish the family's philanthropic image." Rachel started with the Portland Harbor Collection, hoping to find images of her great-grandfather. It didn't take long. In a photograph dated July 1943, she found him, Jeremiah Thompson, standing proudly on the deck of a fishing boat with Compass Rose painted on its bow. He was a tall, weathered man with kind eyes and capable hands, wearing the practical clothes of someone who made his living from the sea. He looked nothing like the kind of man who would take unnecessary risks in rough weather. But it was in the Sterling Family Collection that Rachel made the discovery that changed everything. In a formal portrait dated 1942, she found Josiah Sterling, posed in what was clearly meant to be a captain's uniform, but which looked somehow theatrical, like a costume rather than working clothes. He was younger than Jeremiah Thompson, maybe in his early 30s, with sharp features and calculating eyes. But the truly shocking discovery was in a group photograph dated September 1943, just 1 month after Jeremiah Thompson's death. It showed a celebration at what appeared to be Sterling Maritime Holdings offices, with Josiah Sterling at the center, surrounded by well-dressed men raising glasses of champagne. The caption, written in fading ink on the back of the photograph, read, "Celebrating the acquisition of Thompson Maritime Assets, September 1943. Dr. Greenfield," Rachel said, her voice tight with controlled anger, "look at this photograph. These men are celebrating my great-grandfather's death." Dr. Greenfield examined the image carefully, then consulted his records. "The timing is certainly callous, but Rachel, you have to understand that business acquisitions were often celebrated this way, even if the circumstances were tragic. But look at the faces," Rachel insisted. "These aren't men who are sorry about a tragic accident. These are men who are celebrating getting exactly what they wanted." She was right. The expressions in the photograph were triumphant, not somber. These were men who had achieved a goal, not men who had stumbled into good fortune through tragedy. Dr. Greenfield studied the photograph more carefully, then pulled out a magnifying glass. "There's something else here," he said after a moment. "Look at what Josiah Sterling is wearing." Rachel looked through the magnifying glass and gasped. Clearly visible on Josiah Sterling's vest was a silver watch chain, and hanging from that chain was an object that was unmistakably the compass she had seen William Sterling wearing the night before. "That's it," she breathed. "That's the same compass. But that's impossible," Dr. Greenfield said. "If this compass belonged to Jeremiah Thompson, how would Josiah Sterling have it just 1 month after Thompson's death?" Rachel sat back in her chair, the full horror of what she was looking at finally becoming clear. Because he took it, along with everything else. The boats, the wharf, the fishing rights, and the compass that proved who really owned them all. The compass wasn't just a family heirloom. It was a trophy. Josiah Sterling had kept it as a symbol of his victory over Jeremiah Thompson, and 3 generations of Sterlings had worn it without understanding that they were displaying evidence of their family's original crime. "Dr. Greenfield," Rachel said, her voice steady despite the rage building inside her, "I need copies of all of these photographs, and I need the contact information for the most aggressive investigative journalist you know." Meanwhile, 30 miles away in his glass and steel office overlooking Casco Bay, William Sterling was having the most uncomfortable morning of his adult life. The encounter with Rachel Thompson at the Anchor's Rest had shaken him more than he cared to admit. Not because of her accusations, which were clearly the desperate fantasies of someone facing economic hardship, but because of the certainty in her voice when she had spoken about the compass. "True north always," pointing to Thompson's Wharf. How could she have known that? Sterling pulled the compass from his vest pocket and examined it carefully. He had worn it every day for 15 years, ever since his father had given it to him on his 30th birthday. It was a beautiful piece, masterfully crafted, but he had never paid close attention to its function. He had assumed it was simply decorative, a symbol of the family's maritime heritage. But now, sitting in his office with Portland Harbor spread out below him, he opened the compass and watched its needle. The woman had been right. Instead of pointing north, the needle pointed steadily toward the northeast, toward the cluster of old warehouses and fishing piers that included Thompson's Wharf. Sterling felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. If Rachel Thompson was right about the compass, what else might she be right about? He picked up his phone and dialed his attorney, Marcus Webb, a ruthlessly efficient lawyer who had handled the Sterling family's legal affairs for over 20 years. "Marcus, I need you to pull all the records related to Sterling Maritime Holdings acquisitions in the 1940s. Specifically, anything related to fishing operations owned by a man named Jeremiah Thompson." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "William, those records are over 70 years old. Why the sudden interest in ancient history?" "Just pull them," Sterling said curtly. "I need to see the documentation for how we acquired those assets." "All right, but it may take some time to locate files that old." "Is this urgent?" Sterling looked down at the compass in his hand, its needle still pointing steadily toward Thompson's Wharf, like an accusing finger. "Yes, Marcus, it's urgent." After he hung up, Sterling walked to his office windows and stared out at Portland Harbor. The waterfront had changed dramatically since the 1940s, but Thompson's Wharf was still there, a weathered pier that jutted into the harbor like a stubborn reminder of the past. Sterling Development Corporation had been trying to acquire that wharf for 5 years, but the current owner, an elderly fisherman named Frank Kowalski, had refused every offer. For the first time, Sterling wondered if there might be a connection between Kowalski's stubborn refusal to sell and the Thompson family's historical claims to the property. If Jeremiah Thompson had really owned that wharf, and if his ownership had been illegally transferred to Sterling Maritime Holdings, then Frank Kowalski might be unknowingly sitting on stolen property. And if Rachel Thompson could prove it, she wouldn't just be claiming a compass. She would be claiming ownership of some of the most valuable waterfront real estate in Maine. Sterling's phone buzzed with an incoming call. The caller ID showed Marcus Webb. "That was fast," Sterling said as he answered. "William, we have a problem," Marcus said without preamble. "I started pulling those files you requested, and there are some significant gaps in the documentation. The ownership transfer documents for the Thompson fishing operation are incomplete, and some of the financial records appear to have been deliberately destroyed." "What do you mean, deliberately destroyed?" "I mean, someone went through these files and removed specific documents. What's left looks like it was designed to cover up rather than document the actual transaction. And William, there's something else you need to know. Sterling sat down heavily in his chair, the compass weighing heavily in his hand. "What?" "I found a sealed envelope in your grandfather Josiah's personal papers, marked not to be opened except in case of challenge to Thompson acquisition. It was never opened because there was never a challenge." "Until now." "Open it," Sterling said. "I already did." "William, your grandfather didn't acquire Jeremiah Thompson's fishing operation through a legitimate business transaction. According to his own notes, he had Thompson killed and forged the ownership transfer documents. The compass mentioned in these notes was kept as proof of the family's victory over their only serious rival for harbor dominance." The phone slipped from Sterling's numb fingers, clattering to the desktop. His grandfather's own confession, hidden away for 70 years, had just confirmed Rachel Thompson's accusations. The Sterling family fortune wasn't built on business acumen and maritime expertise. It was built on murder and theft. And somewhere across town, a bartender who had lost everything was about to discover that she was the rightful heir to half of the Portland waterfront. The war between the Sterlings and the Thompsons was about to begin again, and this time the Thompson family had justice on their side. Rachel's phone rang at 7:30 that evening, while she was getting ready for her shift at the Anchor's Rest. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but she answered anyway, hoping it might be Professor Hartwell finally returning her calls. "Miss Thompson, this is Marcus Webb, attorney for Sterling Development Corporation. Mr. Sterling would like to meet with you tomorrow morning to discuss your recent concerns about certain family artifacts." Rachel's heart began pounding. She had expected Sterling to ignore her, or maybe try to have her fired from the tavern. She hadn't expected him to want to meet. "What kind of meeting?" she asked cautiously. "A private discussion about the historical claims you raised last night. Mr. Sterling is prepared to offer a substantial settlement in exchange for your agreement to cease making public statements about Sterling family heirlooms. A settlement. He was trying to buy her off, just like his grandfather had probably tried to buy off Jeremiah Thompson 70 years ago. "I'm not interested in a settlement, Mr. Webb. I'm interested in the truth. Miss Thompson, I strongly advise you to reconsider. Mr. Sterling is being generous. If you continue to pursue these baseless claims, you may find yourself facing defamation charges and legal expenses you cannot afford." The threat was politely worded, but unmistakable. "Cooperate and take the money, or be destroyed by legal bills and criminal charges. Tell Mr. Sterling that if he wants to discuss the truth about what happened to Jeremiah Thompson, he can meet me at Thompson's Wharf tomorrow at noon. And tell him to bring the compass." Rachel hung up before Webb could respond. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear. From anger. The Sterling family had destroyed her great-grandfather, driven her father into poverty, and left her working dead-end jobs to survive. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated what a Thompson was willing to fight for. That night at the Anchor's Rest, Rachel worked her shift with unusual energy, serving drinks and taking orders, while her mind raced with plans. She had called 3 local reporters, emailed the story to 2 investigative journalists from the Portland Phoenix, and sent copies of the historical photographs to Professor Hartwell with a detailed explanation of what she had discovered. By morning, the story would be public. William Sterling would no longer be able to suppress the truth with legal threats and financial pressure. The court of public opinion would hear about Jeremiah Thompson and his stolen legacy. At 11:45 the next morning, Rachel stood on Thompson's Wharf, looking out over Portland Harbor and trying to imagine what it had looked like in her great-grandfather's time. The wharf was weathered and worn, but still solid, built to last by men who understood the sea and respected its power. Frank Kowalski's lobster boat was tied up at the far end, and the old fisherman himself sat on a crate, mending nets, pretending not to notice the drama that was about to unfold on his pier. William Sterling arrived precisely at noon, accompanied by his attorney and 2 men who looked like private security. He was dressed more casually than he had been at the tavern, but he still radiated wealth and authority. The silver compass chain was visible at his vest, catching the cold February sunlight. "Miss Thompson," Sterling said as he approached, "I hope you've reconsidered our offer." "I have," Rachel replied, "and I'm rejecting it. Just like my great-grandfather rejected whatever offer your grandfather made before he had him killed." Sterling's face went pale, but his voice remained steady. "That's a very serious accusation." "It's not an accusation anymore, Mr. Sterling. It's a documented fact." Rachel pulled out her phone and showed him the photographs she had taken at the Maine Historical Society. "Your grandfather's own records confirm it. He had Jeremiah Thompson murdered and stole everything he owned, including the compass you're wearing right now." Marcus Webb stepped forward. "Miss Thompson, I must warn you that making false statements—" "They're not false," interrupted a new voice. Professor Elizabeth Hartwell walked down the wharf toward them, carrying a briefcase and wearing the satisfied expression of an academic who had just solved a 70-year-old mystery. "I've spent the last 18 hours verifying every detail of Ms. Thompson's research, and I can confirm that her conclusions are correct." Professor Hartwell opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder of documents. "Gentlemen, meet the real history of the Sterling family fortune. Your grandfather, Josiah Sterling, was not a merchant marine captain. He was a small-time criminal from Boston who came to Portland in 1941 with forged credentials and a plan to take over the fishing industry through intimidation and violence. She handed copies of documents to Sterling and his attorney. These are FBI records from 1943, declassified just last year. The federal government was investigating Josiah Sterling for racketeering and suspected murder. But the case was dropped when their primary witness, Jeremiah Thompson, died in what they believed was a suspicious boating accident." Sterling stared at the documents, his face growing paler with each page. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and completely damning to his family's reputation. "But here's the thing, Mr. Sterling," Professor Hartwell continued. "The FBI case was never officially closed. It was merely suspended pending the discovery of new evidence. Miss Thompson's research provides that evidence." She turned to Rachel with a smile. "Congratulations, my dear. You've just solved one of Maine's oldest cold cases." At that moment, Frank Kowalski stood up from his net mending and walked over to join the group. The old fisherman's weathered face was grim but satisfied. "About time someone figured it out," he said in his thick Maine accent. "My father worked for Jeremiah Thompson. He was there the night Jeremiah was killed. Said it wasn't no accident. Josiah Sterling and 2 other men took him out in that dinghy, and only Sterling came back." Frank pulled a folded piece of paper from his shirt pocket. "My father made me promise to keep this safe in case anyone ever came looking for the truth. It's a deed signed by Jeremiah Thompson the day before he died, leaving Thompson's Wharf to his son Thomas, in case anything happened to him." He handed the deed to Rachel. "Thomas Thompson was your father, wasn't he? That makes you the rightful owner of this wharf, and probably a good chunk of the rest of the waterfront too." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of waves lapping against the pier and the distant cry of seagulls. William Sterling stood motionless, holding the FBI documents that proved his entire life had been built on a foundation of blood and lies. Finally, he reached up and slowly removed the silver compass from his watch chain. He held it out to Rachel, his hand trembling slightly. "This belongs to you," he said quietly. "It's always belonged to you." Rachel took the compass, feeling its familiar weight in her palm. When she opened it, the needle swung immediately to point at the wharf beneath her feet, just as it had for 70 years, patiently waiting for a Thompson to come home. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice steady and strong, "you're right. It does belong to me, and so does everything else your family stole from mine." The battle for justice was far from over. But standing on Thompson's Wharf, with her great-grandfather's compass in her hand and the proof of her family's legacy finally revealed, Rachel Thompson knew that this time the Thompsons would not be silenced. The truth had found its way home, just like the compass always knew it would. The aftermath of the confrontation at Thompson's Wharf unfolded with the inexorable power of a Maine nor'easter. Within 24 hours, the story had spread beyond local media to regional and then national outlets. The headline in the Portland Press-Herald read, "70-year cover-up exposed. Local bartender proves family was murdered for waterfront." Empire, the Boston Globe ran a front-page story titled, "The Sterling Scandal, How a Media." Empire was built on murder and theft, but the real drama was playing out behind closed doors in Sterling Development. Corporation's boardroom, where William Sterling faced a revolt from his own board of directors. The revelation that the company's foundational assets had been acquired through murder and fraud had triggered a corporate crisis. Margaret Blackwood, the company's longest-serving board member, spoke for the group. "William, if Rachel Thompson can prove legal ownership of Thompson's Wharf and the associated fishing rights, she could claim damages that would bankrupt this company." Sterling sat at the head of the polished conference table, the silver compass beside his legal pad like an accusation. He had spent the past 18 hours consulting with attorneys and crisis management specialists, all of whom had delivered the same devastating assessment. The Sterling family's legal exposure was potentially unlimited. "The historical record is clear," Marcus Webb reported to the assembled board members. "Josiah Sterling committed murder and fraud on a massive scale. Every property acquisition that followed is traceable back to assets that were illegally obtained." Board member Jonathan Hayes leaned forward with barely controlled anger. "Are you telling us that this entire company is built on stolen property? That our investments are tied to a murder that happened in 1943? "That's exactly what I'm telling you," Webb replied grimly. "And the FBI has reopened their investigation. If they can build a case for ongoing criminal enterprise, they could seize all corporate assets under RICO statutes." The room fell silent, except for the sound of expensive pens clicking nervously. These were people accustomed to controlling situations through money and influence, but they were facing something that couldn't be bought. Historical truth backed by federal law enforcement. Margaret Blackwood was the first to speak. "William, what do you propose we do?" Sterling looked around the table at faces that had once regarded him with respect, now reflecting suspicion and barely concealed panic. "I propose we do the right thing," Sterling said quietly. "We acknowledge what happened. We make full restitution to Rachel Thompson for her family's losses. And we restructure this company to operate legitimately going forward." Jonathan Hayes slammed his hand on the table. "The right thing? You want us to voluntarily destroy everything we've worked for to satisfy the demands of a bartender who stumbled onto some old documents. That bartender is the rightful heir to assets worth approximately $200 million, Sterling replied. "She could take everything through the courts and leave us with nothing. I'm suggesting we negotiate while we still have something left." Margaret Blackwood pulled out her phone and began calculating rapidly. $200 million in current market value, plus 70 years of compound interest, plus punitive damages for fraud and wrongful death. "William, she could be entitled to the entire company and then some." The mathematical reality of their situation settled over the room like a funeral shroud. Rachel Thompson wasn't just seeking justice for a historical wrong. She was the legal owner of the majority of Sterling Development Corporation's assets. Meanwhile, across town, Rachel sat surrounded by legal documents and 3 expensive attorneys. Catherine Morrison, a senior partner at Portland's most prestigious law firm, had convinced Rachel she was dealing with something much bigger than imagined. "Ms. Thompson," Morrison had explained, "based on the documents you've provided, you have a legitimate claim to what may be the largest wrongful inheritance case in Maine history. We're not talking about recovering a compass and a wharf. We're talking about recovering 70 years of profits from an entire maritime empire. Now, surrounded by legal experts mapping out the Sterling family's crimes, Rachel was beginning to understand what her great-grandfather had lost and what she stood to recover. The fishing rights alone would be worth approximately $50 million, explained maritime attorney David Chen. Then there's the real estate, added Morrison. Your great-grandfather owned 12 different waterfront properties. Sterling Development has been developing those properties for decades, earning hundreds of millions. Rachel looked at the financial projections. How much are we talking about total? Conservative estimate. $400 million, plus compound interest and punitive damages. We're talking about potentially the largest financial restitution case in Maine legal history. The number was staggering. Rachel Thompson, who had been living paycheck to paycheck just a week ago, was potentially one of the wealthiest people in New England. But looking around at the lawyers who saw dollar signs and fame, Rachel felt sadness rather than excitement. The money wouldn't bring back her great-grandfather or undo 70 years of her family's struggle. What I want isn't just money, she said finally. I want the truth to be acknowledged. I want my great-grandfather's name restored. And I want to make sure that what happened to Jeremiah Thompson never happens to another working family in Maine. Morrison nodded approvingly. Those are admirable goals, Rachel. But you need to understand, William Sterling will fight this with everything he has. They'll hire the best lawyers, discredit the evidence, and paint you as a gold digger. Let them try, Rachel said firmly. I have the truth on my side. And I have something else they don't have. What's that? Rachel pulled the silver compass from her pocket, opening it to reveal the needle pointing toward Thompson's Wharf. I have my great-grandfather's compass, and it's been pointing me home for 70 years. The war between the Sterlings and the Thompsons was about to begin in earnest. But this time, the Thompson family had more than just courage and determination. They had the law, they had justice, and they had a compass that always pointed toward the truth. 2 months later, the legal battle had captured national attention. The story had everything that fascinated the American public: murder, corporate corruption, and a working-class hero fighting powerful elites. Major media outlets covered the case extensively. The real action was taking place in the Cumberland County Superior Court, where Judge Patricia Winters was presiding over what legal experts were calling the most complex inheritance case in Maine history. The courtroom was packed with reporters and legal observers invested in Rachel's fight for justice. Sterling Development Corporation had hired Brennan and Associates, a Boston law firm known for defending corporate executives. Their strategy was predictable: attack the credibility of the historical evidence, question Rachel's motives, and argue that the current Sterling family shouldn't be held responsible for events that happened before they were born. Jonathan Brennan, the firm's senior partner, painted Rachel as an opportunist who had constructed an elaborate fraud to profit from family tragedy. Your Honor, Brennan argued, the plaintiff asks this court to overturn 70 years of legitimate business development based on nothing more than circumstantial evidence, dubious historical documents, and the convenient discovery of supposed family heirlooms. This is not a case about justice. This is a case about greed. But when Catherine Morrison rose to present Rachel's case, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted dramatically. Morrison was a formidable attorney with a reputation for thorough preparation and devastating cross-examinations. She had spent months building an airtight case that would leave no room for doubt about what had happened to Jeremiah Thompson. Your Honor, Morrison began, the defense would have you believe that this case is about ancient history and dubious claims. But this case is about something much more fundamental: whether murder and theft become legitimate simply because enough time has passed, and whether the victims of corporate violence can be permanently silenced by power and money. Morrison's first witness was Professor Elizabeth Hartwell, who methodically walked the court through 70 years of evidence, from Jeremiah Thompson's original business records to the FBI files that documented federal suspicions about his death. Professor Hartwell, Morrison asked, in your professional opinion, was Jeremiah Thompson's death consistent with an accidental drowning? Absolutely not, Professor Hartwell replied firmly. Captain Thompson was an experienced seaman who had worked these waters for 20 years. The weather conditions were not severe enough to pose a danger to an experienced captain. Moreover, the location where his body was found was inconsistent with the tidal patterns. What is your professional conclusion about the circumstances of Captain Thompson's death? Based on the totality of the evidence, Professor Hartwell said, looking directly at the jury, I believe Jeremiah Thompson was murdered to prevent him from opposing Josiah Sterling's takeover of his fishing operation. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, and Judge Winters called for order. But the damage to Sterling's case was already evident in the expressions of the jury members, who had listened to Professor Hartwell's testimony with growing horror and sympathy for Rachel's family. Morrison's next witness was Frank Kowalski, the elderly fisherman whose father had worked for Jeremiah Thompson. Despite his age and the intimidation tactics Sterling's attorneys had employed to discourage his testimony, Frank took the stand with the quiet dignity of a man who had spent his life telling the truth. "Mr. Kowalski," Morrison asked, "what did your father tell you about the night Jeremiah Thompson died?" "My father was working late on the wharf that night," Frank replied in his thick Maine accent. "He saw Josiah Sterling and 2 other men take Captain Thompson out in that dinghy. Only Sterling came back. Did your father report what he saw to the authorities?" Frank's weathered face darkened with old anger. He tried to. But the police in those days, they didn't much care what a dock worker had to say about the death of a fishing captain, especially when the man asking the questions had money and connections. "Mr. Kowalski, why are you willing to testify about these events now?" Frank looked across the courtroom at Rachel, his eyes bright with determination. "Because Jeremiah Thompson was a good man who deserved better than he got, and because his great-granddaughter deserves to know the truth about what happened to her family." The most dramatic moment came when Catherine Morrison called William Sterling to the stand. Sterling had initially resisted testifying, but Morrison had successfully argued that as the current head of the company, he was a necessary witness. Sterling took the stand in an expensive Navy suit, but his usual authority had been replaced by tense defensiveness. He answered Morrison's initial questions with clipped, careful responses. But Morrison knew exactly how to break through Sterling's defenses. "Mr. Sterling," she said, approaching with a document, "I'm showing you Plaintiff's Exhibit 47. Do you recognize this document?" Sterling examined the paper and his face went ashen. It was a letter from his grandfather Josiah to his father Robert, dated 1960, discussing the Thompson problem and the need to ensure that sleeping dogs remain sleeping. "This is a private family letter," Sterling said, his voice tight with anger. "A private family letter in which your grandfather explicitly discusses covering up his murder of Jeremiah Thompson," Morrison corrected. "Mr. Sterling, were you aware that your family's fortune was built on murder and theft?" Jonathan Brennan shot to his feet. "Objection. The witness is not on trial for his grandfather's alleged crimes." "Sustained," Judge Winters ruled, but the damage was done. The jury had heard Morrison's question, and they had seen Sterling's reaction. Morrison continued her methodical destruction of Sterling's credibility, forcing him to acknowledge the inconsistencies in his family's official history, the suspicious timing of business acquisitions, and the deliberate destruction of historical records that might have revealed the truth decades earlier. But it was Morrison's final question that delivered the killing blow to Sterling's case. "Mr. Sterling," she said, holding up the silver compass that had started everything, "you wore this compass for 15 years, believing it belonged to your family. When you learned it actually belonged to Jeremiah Thompson, the man your grandfather murdered, what did you do?" Sterling stared at the compass, then looked at Rachel sitting at the plaintiff's table. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I gave it back," he whispered. "You gave it back," Morrison repeated, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "Because even you recognized that wearing the compass of a murdered man was morally wrong." "No further questions, Your Honor." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned to the courtroom, their faces showed the gravity of the decision they had reached. Judge Winters asked the foreman to read the verdict, and the man stood with visible emotion. On the question of whether Jeremiah Thompson was the rightful owner of the maritime assets claimed by Sterling Development Corporation, we find in favor of the plaintiff. On the question of damages, we award Rachel Thompson the sum of $600 million, representing the current value of the stolen assets, plus compound interest and punitive damages. The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause that Judge Winters made no attempt to quiet. Rachel sat motionless, tears streaming down her face, as Catherine Morrison embraced her and whispered, "You did it. You got justice for your family." But it was William Sterling's reaction that would be remembered by everyone who witnessed it. Instead of anger or defiance, his face showed something unexpected: relief. The weight of carrying his family's secret for his entire adult life had finally been lifted, even though it had cost him everything he thought he cared about. After the courtroom cleared, Sterling approached Rachel in the hallway outside. His attorneys tried to stop him, but he waved them away. "Miss Thompson," he said quietly, "I want you to know that what happened to your great-grandfather was wrong. What my grandfather did was monstrous, and my family has profited from that crime for 70 years. You deserve to know the truth, and you deserve justice." Rachel looked at the man who had been her family's enemy, seeing not the arrogant billionaire she had confronted at the Anchor's Rest, but a human being who had discovered that his entire life had been built on a lie. "Mr. Sterling," she said, "I don't want to destroy you or your family. I just wanted the truth to be told, and I want to make sure that companies can't profit from violence and theft without ever being held accountable." Sterling nodded, understanding that Rachel's victory was about more than money. It was about justice, accountability, and the principle that truth could never be permanently buried by power and wealth. 6 months later, Rachel stood on the deck of the newly restored Compass Rose, a fishing boat she had commissioned to honor her great-grandfather's memory. The silver compass hung from her neck, its needle pointing steadily toward Thompson's Wharf, which was now officially Thompson's Wharf again, bearing a bronze plaque that told the true story of Jeremiah Thompson and his stolen legacy. Rachel had used part of her settlement to establish the Jeremiah Thompson Foundation, which provided legal assistance to working families facing corporate intimidation and helped preserve Maine's maritime heritage. The foundation had already helped 12 fishing families retain their properties against aggressive development pressure, and it had funded historical preservation projects up and down the coast. William Sterling had kept his promise to cooperate fully with the FBI investigation into his family's crimes. Sterling Development Corporation had been restructured and placed under federal oversight, with new leadership committed to legitimate business practices. Sterling himself had moved to a modest house in Vermont, where he was teaching business ethics at a small college and trying to make amends for his family's legacy of violence and corruption. But for Rachel, the most meaningful victory wasn't financial or legal. It was standing on the deck of a boat bearing her great-grandfather's name, looking out over waters he had fished 70 years ago, knowing that his story would never be forgotten again. The compass had kept its promise. It had pointed her home, not just to a place, but to the truth. And in finding that truth, Rachel Thompson had done more than recover her family's stolen legacy. She had proved that justice, no matter how long delayed, could never be permanently denied. As the sun set over Portland Harbor, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Rachel opened the compass one more time. The needle swung to point at Thompson's Wharf, just as it always had, but now it was pointing to something more than just a piece of property. It was pointing to a legacy restored, a truth acknowledged, and a promise kept across 3 generations of struggle and loss. The Thompson family had finally come home. This story reminds us that the truth has a power that transcends time and wealth, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not for money or power, but for dignity, justice, and the right to know who we really are. Rachel Thompson's courage to confront a powerful family with evidence of their crimes shows us that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they refuse to be intimidated by wealth and power. What would you have done in Rachel's position? Would you have accepted William Sterling's settlement offer, or would you have fought for the complete truth, regardless of the personal cost? How far would you go to restore your family's honor and ensure that justice is served? Share your thoughts and remember to subscribe for more stories of ordinary people finding the strength to fight impossible odds and win.